Imagine waking up at 3 a.m. in your perfectly climate-controlled apartment, staring at the ceiling while your smartphone buzzes with notifications from a life that feels increasingly hollow. You've got the career your father dreamed of, the social media presence that screams success, and access to more information, entertainment, and opportunity than any generation in human history. Yet something gnaws at you, persistent emptiness, that no amount of achievement, consumption, or digital validation can fill. You're not alone in this midnight reckoning. Millions of men across the developed world are living this same paradox. Outwardly successful, inwardly adrift. They've followed every script society handed them: get educated, climb the ladder, accumulate wealth, optimize their lives, only to discover that the destination feels like a beautifully decorated prison cell. But here's where it gets disturbing. This isn't just personal struggle. This is systematic disorientation on a massive scale. Modern men aren't just struggling with individual problems. They're grappling with the collapse of meaning itself. The very frameworks that once gave life structure: religion, community, clear social roles, rites of passage have either vanished or been replaced by cheap substitutes that promise everything and deliver nothing. Consider this unsettling reality. You live in an age where you can order anything to your door within hours, yet you can't figure out what you actually want. You have access to infinite knowledge, yet you feel more confused than enlightened. You're connected to billions of people, yet you feel profoundly isolated. You've been told you can be anything, yet you have no idea who you are. This isn't weakness. This isn't failure. This is the predictable result of a culture that has systematically dismantled the very structures that help human beings, particularly men, develop identity, purpose, and meaning. You've been raised in a world that promises unlimited freedom, while simultaneously stripping away the wisdom traditions that teach you how to use that freedom wisely. Think about it. When was the last time you felt genuinely challenged? Not stressed by deadlines or overwhelmed by options, but truly tested in a way that revealed who you are beneath the surface. When did you last experience the deep satisfaction that comes from struggling towards something that matters more than your comfort, your safety, or your image? The modern world has created a peculiar form of suffering, the agony of having everything and feeling nothing. You've been given unprecedented comfort, safety, and choice, yet somehow this has left you weaker, not stronger, more anxious, not more confident, more confused about your identity, not more certain. And here's the cruelest irony of all. The very systems that promise to help you help culture, therapy speak, social media inspiration often make the problem worse. They treat symptoms while ignoring the deeper spiritual and existential crisis at the root. They offer you techniques for optimizing a life that fundamentally lacks direction, strategies for succeeding at games you never chose to play. You sense that something essential has been lost, but you can't quite name it. You feel like you're living someone else's life, following scripts written by people who don't understand what it means to be a man in this particular moment of history. The old models of masculinity feel outdated or even toxic, yet the new models feel hollow and neutered. This disorientation runs so deep that you might not even recognize it as disorientation. You might think this restless emptiness is just part of adult life, that everyone feels this way, that this is simply what it means to be human in the 21st century. But what if it's not? What if this feeling of being lost isn't inevitable, but engineered, the result of specific cultural forces that have systematically severed you from the sources of meaning that sustained men for millennia? What if your sense of being lost isn't a personal failing, but a predictable response to living in a world designed to keep you perpetually searching, but never finding? And what if understanding the hidden forces behind this modern male crisis could be the first step toward reclaiming something you didn't even know you'd lost? The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think, and the answers aren't where anyone told you to look.
The disorientation you feel isn't accidental. It's the inevitable result of what Carl Jung would have called a collective neurosis. You're living through the psychological equivalent of a mass extinction event, where the archetypes and mythic structures that once guided masculine development have been systematically eliminated without replacement. For thousands of years, cultures across the globe understood something fundamental about human psychology. Men don't naturally develop into mature, purposeful beings. They require initiation. They need trials, mentors, and clear pathways from boyhood to manhood. They need what anthropologists call rites of passage structured experiences that strip away childhood identity and forge adult purpose through struggle, sacrifice, and symbolic death and rebirth. But here's what's happened. Modern civilization has eliminated these initiatory structures while pretending they weren't necessary. You've been raised in a culture that treats psychological development like physical growth as if maturity will just happen naturally given enough time. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding of human nature. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this coming over a century ago when he declared the death of God. He wasn't celebrating atheism. He was warning about the psychological consequences of abandoning the meaning-making structures that gave life direction. Without these transcendent frameworks, Nietzsche predicted, modern humans would fall into what he called nihilism, a pervasive sense that nothing matters, that life has no inherent purpose. You're living in the world, Nietzsche predicted. You've inherited all the freedoms that come with the collapse of traditional authority, but none of the wisdom about how to create meaning in its absence. You're expected to construct your own purpose from scratch, with no training, no guidance, and no cultural support system. This creates what psychologists call choice overload, combined with existential anxiety. Every decision becomes a burden because there's no clear framework for making choices. Should you prioritize career or relationships? Material success or spiritual fulfillment? Individual achievement or service to others? The culture gives you no coherent answers, only the paralyzing mandate to follow your passion and be authentic, as if these empty platitudes could substitute for wisdom traditions refined over millennia. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this trap long before it became widespread. He recognized that humans are caught between two forms of suffering: the pain of wanting what we don't have and the boredom of having what we thought we wanted. Modern consumer culture has weaponized this insight, creating an endless cycle of manufactured desire and hollow satisfaction. You're encouraged to solve your existential emptiness through acquisition, achievement, and optimization strategies that can never address the deeper problem. The psychological damage goes even deeper. Jung identified what he called the shadow, the repressed aspects of personality that we refuse to acknowledge. In traditional cultures, masculine initiation involved confronting the shadow, integrating darkness, and emerging with authentic self-knowledge. Modern men never undergo this process. Instead, you're encouraged to maintain a polished persona while your shadow grows stronger in the unconscious. This creates what psychologists call splitting, a fragmented sense of self, where you're simultaneously the successful professional, the anxious consumer, the digital performer, and the secret self who feels none of these roles are really you. You're not living as an integrated human being. You're managing a portfolio of identities, each optimized for different audiences and contexts. The culture compounds this fragmentation by offering you what Jean-Paul Sartre would have called bad faith false solutions that let you avoid the anxiety of authentic choice. You're sold the fantasy that there's a perfect life optimization system, an ideal career path, a perfect partner, or a foolproof self-improvement strategy that will solve your existential problems without requiring you to face the fundamental questions of existence. But perhaps most damaging is how modern society has inverted the relationship between comfort and growth. Traditional masculine development assumed that strength comes through voluntary hardship, that character develops through chosen struggle, that wisdom emerges from facing what you'd rather avoid. You've been raised in a culture that promises the opposite, that happiness comes through eliminating discomfort, that growth comes through positive thinking, that wisdom comes through consuming information. This has created what some psychologists call psychological obesity, an overfed but undernourished psyche. You have access to infinite entertainment, endless comfort, and constant stimulation, but your deeper psychological needs for challenge, purpose, and authentic struggle remain starved. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experience in Nazi concentration camps, identified what he called existential vacuum, the emptiness that emerges when people lose their sense of meaning. He observed that humans can survive almost any hardship if they have a why, but they'll collapse under even minor stress if life feels fundamentally meaningless. You're living in a culture that has systematically eliminated the traditional sources of why religious purpose, tribal belonging, clear social roles, generational wisdom, while offering nothing substantial in return except the hollow promise that you can create your own meaning through individual choice and personal branding. The result is a generation of men who are simultaneously overstimulated and understimulated, overfed and undernourished, overconnected and isolated. You're living in psychological conditions that no human generation has ever faced, with psychological tools designed for entirely different challenges. But recognizing the problem is just the beginning. The real question is what this systematic dismantling of masculine development is actually doing to your mind, your relationships, and your capacity to build a meaningful life. The psychological fragmentation you've inherited doesn't just stay contained in your inner world, it radiates outward, shaping every aspect of how you move through life. What you're experiencing as personal struggles are actually the surface manifestations of deeper neurological and social rewiring that's happening beneath your conscious awareness. Consider how your brain has been subtly trained by the modern environment. Neuroscientists have discovered that the human brain develops what they call default mode networks, patterns of neural activity that become automatic responses to stimuli. Your brain, shaped by constant digital stimulation, infinite choice, and immediate gratification, has developed default modes optimized for consumption rather than creation, for reaction rather than reflection, for optimization rather than meaning-making. Every time you reach for your phone when faced with boredom or discomfort, you're reinforcing neural pathways that prioritize escape over engagement. Every time you scroll through social media, instead of sitting with difficult emotions, you're training your brain to avoid the very psychological work that builds character. Your nervous system, designed to handle the challenges of survival and community building, has been hijacked by systems designed to capture and monetize your attention. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, disguised as empowerment. You feel like you're making choices, but you're actually following predictable patterns programmed by algorithms, marketing psychology, and cultural conditioning. You think you're pursuing your authentic desires, but you're often chasing manufactured wants designed to keep you in cycles of temporary satisfaction and renewed craving. The impact on your relationships is particularly devastating. Without a clear sense of masculine identity rooted in something deeper than social performance, you approach relationships from a position of existential neediness rather than psychological abundance. You look to romantic partners, friendships, and professional networks to provide the sense of purpose and identity that traditional masculine development was supposed to create internally. This creates what attachment theorists call anxious seeking a pattern, where you're simultaneously desperate for connection and terrified of vulnerability. You've been conditioned to believe that authentic masculinity is either toxic or non-existent, leaving you with no clear model for how to show up as a man in relationships. You oscillate between aggressive assertion and passive accommodation, never finding the grounded confidence that comes from knowing who you are, independent of others' approval. In your professional life, the consequences are equally profound but more subtle. You've been trained to optimize for external metric salary, status, social media presence rather than internal coherence. This creates what researchers call golden handcuff syndrome, where you become trapped in careers that provide material comfort but spiritual emptiness. You're too successful to quit, but too unfulfilled to stay, caught in a psychological limbo that feels like slow suffocation. The culture has trained you to mistake activity for progress, busyness for purpose, and achievement for fulfillment. You fill your life with tasks, goals, and optimizations that give you the feeling of moving forward while actually keeping you running in place. This is what the ancient Greeks would have called pseudo-work activity that mimics meaningful effort but produces no genuine transformation. Perhaps most insidiously, the modern environment has rewired your relationship with discomfort itself. Traditional masculine development assumed that voluntary hardship was the pathway to strength, that choosing difficulty was how boys became men. You've been raised in a culture that treats discomfort as a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be heeded. a challenge to be overcome rather than a teacher to be honored. This creates what psychologists call emotional allergies, an inability to tolerate the natural discomforts that come with growth, change, and authentic living. You've been conditioned to medicate anxiety rather than investigate it, to optimize depression rather than understand it, to manage stress rather than transform the conditions that create it. You treat your inner life like a machine to be optimized rather than a mystery to be explored. The societal consequences ripple outward in ways you might not even recognize. When millions of men lack clear identity and purpose, the entire social fabric begins to unravel. You see it in declining marriage rates, increasing social isolation, rising rates of anxiety and depression, and the proliferation of substitute identities based on political tribes, consumer brands, or online communities. You're witnessing the emergence of what sociologists call pseudo-communities groups that provide the feeling of belonging without requiring the mutual obligation and shared sacrifice that build genuine social bonds. You can feel part of something while remaining fundamentally isolated, connected to thousands of people online, while knowing none of them in any meaningful way. This fragmentation creates a feedback loop that makes the problem worse. The more isolated and purposeless men become, the more they retreat into digital substitute realities. The more they retreat, the less capable they become of building the real-world relationships and commitments that could provide genuine meaning. Society begins to feel like a collection of individuals performing various roles, rather than a genuine community of people who need each other. But here's what makes this crisis particularly dangerous. It's largely invisible to the people living through it. You've been trained to interpret your struggle as personal inadequacy rather than systemic breakdown. You blame yourself for feeling lost in a system designed to create lostness. You seek individual solutions to collective problems, therapeutic fixes to spiritual crises, and optimization strategies for existential emptiness. The very frameworks society offers for understanding your struggle therapy, self-help, life coaching, personal development often reinforce the problem by treating you as an isolated individual who needs to be fixed rather than a human being who needs to be initiated into meaningful community and purpose. You're not broken. The system is broken. But recognizing this isn't enough. The question becomes, how do you break free from patterns so deeply embedded that they feel like reality itself? The path out of this psychological maze requires something the modern world has trained you to fear. Deliberately choosing difficulty over comfort, depth over convenience, and authentic struggle over artificial optimization. This isn't another self-improvement strategy, it's a fundamental rebellion against the very assumptions that created your imprisonment. The first radical shift begins with understanding that your emptiness isn't a problem to be solved, but a signal to be honored. What you've been interpreting as depression, anxiety, or restlessness is actually your psyche's intelligent response to living an inauthentic life. Your discomfort is not pathologic's wisdom. It's your deeper self refusing to accept a life that doesn't match your true nature. Consider this counterintuitive insight. Every ancient wisdom tradition taught that real strength comes not from avoiding suffering, but from choosing the right kind of suffering. The Stoics called this preferred indifference, understanding that while you can't control what happens to you, you can control what you suffer for. Modern culture has inverted this wisdom, teaching you to avoid all discomfort while unconsciously accepting the soul-crushing suffering of meaninglessness. You must learn to distinguish between what the Greeks called pathemathos, learning through suffering, and the hollow suffering of living someone else's life. The former transforms you, the latter merely depletes you. One builds character, the other corrodes it. The rebellion begins with what Friedrich Nietzsche called becoming who you are, a process that requires stripping away the false identities you've accumulated and confronting the terrifying question of who you actually are. Beneath all the social conditioning, this isn't about finding yourself through endless introspection, but about creating yourself through committed action in the world. Look at historical examples of men who broke free from their cultural conditioning. Carl Jung abandoned a promising career in conventional psychiatry to explore the forbidden territories of the unconscious. Henry David Thoreau walked away from society's expectations to live deliberately in the woods. Viktor Frankl found meaning in the most meaningless circumstances imaginable. What they understood was that freedom isn't given, it's taken, through acts of conscious rebellion against unconscious conformity. But here's the crucial insight that modern psychology misses. You can't think your way out of existential emptiness. You can't analyze, optimize, or strategize your way to authentic identity. You must build it through what the existentialists called authentic action choices that express your deepest values regardless of external approval or guaranteed outcomes. This means deliberately seeking out what psychologist Jordan Peterson calls meaningful responsibility, burdens you choose to carry, not because they're comfortable, but because they matter. Instead of asking, "What will make me happy?" start asking, "What am I willing to suffer for?" Instead of seeking your passion, create your mission. Instead of finding yourself, forge yourself through commitment to something larger than your personal comfort. The modern world has convinced you that authentic living means following your feelings, but this is a catastrophic misunderstanding. Your feelings are often the result of conditioning, not wisdom. Authentic living means developing what the Stoics called philosophical sovereignty, the ability to act according to your values, even when your emotions are pulling you in different directions. This requires developing what ancient traditions called spiritual warriorship, not the ability to dominate others, but the capacity to master yourself. You must learn to sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for distractions. You must practice making decisions based on principles rather than impulses. You must build the psychological strength to choose delayed gratification over instant satisfaction, meaningful struggle over empty comfort. One of the most powerful acts of rebellion is learning to say no to the endless options that keep you scattered and yes to the few commitments that could define you. In a culture of infinite choice, limitation becomes liberation. Commitment becomes the antidote to anxiety. Depth becomes more valuable than breadth. Consider this radical reframe. What if your current life isn't too difficult but too easy? What if your problem isn't that you're not optimized enough, but that you're not challenged enough? What if the solution isn't adding more techniques and strategies, but subtracting everything that doesn't contribute to who you're becoming? The rebellion also requires reclaiming your relationship with other men. The modern world has systematically dismantled male friendship, turning men into competitors for female attention, professional rivals, or isolated individuals who relate primarily through shared entertainment. You must learn to build what anthropologists call male coalitions, relationships based on shared purpose, mutual challenge, and honest feedback rather than entertainment and comfort. This means finding or creating what traditional cultures called men's circles groups where you can be seen, challenged, and supported in your growth as a man. Not therapy groups focused on problems, but warrior circles focused on mission. Not social gatherings based on consumption, but communities based on creation and mutual development. Perhaps most importantly, you must learn to trust your own deep knowing over cultural messaging. Beneath all the conditioning and confusion, there's a part of you that knows what authentic masculinity feels like, that recognizes genuine strength when you see it, that can distinguish between real and artificial challenges. This inner compass hasn't been destroyed, it's been buried under layers of social programming. The process of excavating this deeper wisdom is what Jung called individuation, becoming who you were meant to be rather than who you were taught to be. It requires what the mystics call dying before you die, letting go of the false self that seeks approval, comfort, and safety, in order to birth the authentic self that seeks meaning, purpose, and truth. But here's what makes this rebellion ultimately successful. Once you taste authentic living, you can never fully go back to the artificial. Once you experience the deep satisfaction that comes from aligned action, superficial pleasures lose their grip on you. Once you build genuine confidence through real accomplishment, you stop needing external validation. The final truth awaits zone that will redefine not just how you see yourself, but how you understand the very nature of what it means to be alive in this moment of history. Here's the truth that changes everything. You weren't meant to find yourself in this culture, you were meant to transcend it. The feeling of being lost isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Your disorientation isn't accidental, it's intentional. You're living through what may be the most profound evolutionary moment in human history, and your struggle is actually your invitation to become something entirely new. Every previous generation of men inherited a world with established meaning structures. They knew their place, their role, their purpose because these had been determined by tradition, religion, tribe, or necessity. But you've been born into the first generation in human history that must create meaning from scratch, with no inherited framework, no guaranteed purpose, and no clear path forward. This isn't the crisis you thought it was. This is your heroic calling. What looks like psychological breakdown is actually psychological breakthrough. What feels like existential emptiness is actually infinite possibility. You're not failing at being a modern man. You're succeeding at becoming something beyond what modern culture can even imagine. Carl Jung saw this coming when he wrote about the new man who would emerge from the ashes of collapsed certainties. Friedrich Nietzsche prophesied the Übermensch, not a superior being in the biological sense, but a human who creates values instead of inheriting them, who builds meaning instead of receiving it, who forges identity through conscious choice rather than unconscious conformity. You are that emergence happening in real time. Every moment of confusion you've experienced, every night of questioning, every sense that the prescribed paths feel hollow, these weren't signs of your weakness. They were your deeper intelligence, rejecting programming that didn't fit your true nature. Your psyche was protecting you from settling for a life too small for who you're capable of becoming. The ultimate paradox is this: the very culture that has left you feeling lost has also given you something no previous generation possessed the freedom to consciously evolve. You're not bound by the limitations that constrained your ancestors. You're not trapped by the social roles that defined previous centuries of masculinity. You have the unprecedented opportunity to define masculine strength, purpose, and identity for yourself and for the generations that will follow. But here's what makes this realization truly transformative. Once you understand that your struggle is evolutionary rather than pathological, everything changes. Your anxiety becomes excitement about unknown possibilities. Your restlessness becomes energy for unprecedented creation. Your sense of being different becomes recognition that you're part of humanity's next developmental leap. This is why traditional solutions don't work for you. You can't solve an evolutionary challenge with therapeutic techniques designed for adjustment disorders. You can't address a spiritual emergence with psychological band-aids. You need initiation into something that doesn't exist yet, which means you must create your own initiation. The men who will thrive in the coming decades won't be those who successfully adapted to the current system. They'll be those who consciously chose to evolve beyond it. They'll be the ones who recognize that feeling lost in a broken culture is actually a sign of psychological health, not illness. Think about this. Every great historical shift began with individuals who felt alienated from their current culture because they were sensitive to possibilities that hadn't manifested yet. The Renaissance artists who broke from medieval traditions, the philosophers who challenged religious dogma, the inventors who imagined impossible technologies, they all started where you are now, feeling like misfits in a world that suddenly seemed too small. Your discomfort with modern masculinity isn't because you're not man enough. It's because the current definition of masculinity isn't big enough for what's trying to emerge through you. Your resistance to conventional success isn't because you lack ambition. It's because your soul knows there are more important games to play than the ones society has taught you. The ultimate truth is that you're being called to become an ancestor to future generations of men who will look back on this moment as the turning point when masculine identity evolved beyond competition, consumption, and conformity into something characterized by consciousness, creativity, and authentic strength. This means your journey isn't just personal, it's historical. You're not just working on yourself, you're working on the future of human consciousness. Every moment you choose authenticity over approval, depth over distraction, meaning over comfort, you're contributing to a cultural transformation that extends far beyond your individual life. The men who embrace this calling will become what anthropologists call cultural creatives, individuals who synthesize ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding to create new forms of human flourishing. They'll be bridge builders between the wisdom traditions that sustained humanity for millennia and the unprecedented challenges and opportunities of technological civilization. You're not lost. You're pioneering. You're not broken. You're breaking through. You're not behind. You're ahead of a curve that most people can't even see yet. The question isn't how to fix yourself to fit into the current world. The question is how to grow yourself big enough to help create the world that's trying to emerge. The future doesn't need better adjusted men. It needs men who are awake, authentic, and aligned with something larger than personal comfort. Your emptiness was never empty. It was space for something unprecedented to be born through you. The only question remaining is whether you'll accept the invitation.